The night sky blazed with an impossible light as three mysterious figures emerged from the darkness of ancient Persia, their eyes fixed on a single brilliant star that defied every law of astronomy. These were no ordinary travelers. They were the Magi, the wise men whose journey would change the course of human history forever. But who were these enigmatic figures? And why did they risk everything to follow a star across treacherous desert landscapes to find a newborn king they had never seen? From which country are you watching this incredible story unfold? If you're fascinated by the mysteries of biblical history and want to discover the untold secrets of the Magi, hit that subscribe button right now. The story of the Magi begins in the ancient kingdom of Persia, in what we now call Iran, during a time when the world was ruled by mighty empires and ancient wisdom traditions that stretched back thousands of years. These weren't just any scholars or astrologers. They were members of an elite priestly class known as the Magi, a name that would eventually give us our modern word magic. But there was nothing mystical or supernatural about their abilities. These men were the Einsteins and Stephen Hawking of their time, master astronomers who could predict eclipses, calculate planetary movements, and read the stars with mathematical precision that would make modern scientists envious. Picture this scene. Somewhere in the sprawling cities of ancient Persia, in rooms filled with ancient scrolls, star charts, and astronomical instruments, these brilliant minds were conducting their nightly observations of the heavens. Night after night, they tracked the movements of planets, recorded the positions of stars, and calculated celestial events with remarkable accuracy. They knew every constellation, every planet's orbit, every predictable pattern in the night sky. So when something appeared that shouldn't have been there, something that defied every law of celestial mechanics they understood, it stopped them dead in their tracks. The star, and scholars still debate whether it was actually a star, a comet, a planetary conjunction, or something else entirely, appeared suddenly in the constellation of Judah. But this wasn't just any astronomical phenomenon. According to their ancient texts and prophecies, this particular celestial sign could mean only one thing: the birth of a king whose reign would transform the world. Not just any king, but the King of Kings, the Messiah promised in Hebrew scriptures that these Persian wise men had somehow gained access to. But here's where the story gets absolutely mind-blowing. How did Persian astrologers know about Hebrew prophecies? How did they understand the significance of a star appearing over Judea? The answer takes us deep into one of history's most fascinating cultural exchanges. Centuries earlier, when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and took the Hebrew people into exile, something remarkable happened. The Hebrew prophet Daniel, the guy who survived the lion's den, had become one of the most influential figures in the Persian court. He had served under multiple emperors and had established a lasting connection between Hebrew theology and Persian scholarship. Daniel hadn't just survived his exile, he had thrived, becoming the chief of all the wise men in Babylon and later in Persia. Through his influence, Hebrew scriptures and prophecies had become part of the curriculum studied by Persian scholars. For generations, the Magi had been familiar with Hebrew prophecies about a coming Messiah, and they knew exactly what signs to look for. When that star appeared, they didn't hesitate for a moment. They knew what they had to do. The decision to leave everything behind and embark on what would become one of history's most famous journeys wasn't made lightly. These weren't impulsive travelers or religious fanatics. They were respected scholars, advisors to kings, men with comfortable lives and essential responsibilities. Yet something about this celestial sign compelled them to abandon their comfortable existence and set out on a journey that would take them across some of the most dangerous terrain in the ancient world. The journey itself was absolutely epic in scope. We're talking about a trek of over 800 miles across desert landscapes, through mountain passes, past hostile tribes and dangerous wildlife. This wasn't a casual road trip. In the ancient world, such a journey could take anywhere from 2 months to a year, depending on the route, the weather, and countless other factors. They had to carry enough supplies to last for months, hire guards to protect them from bandits, and navigate using only the stars and ancient maps. But the most incredible part of their journey wasn't the physical challenges. It was the treasure they carried with them. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh weren't just random gifts they picked up along the way. Each of these precious items carried profound symbolic meaning, revealing just how much these Persian wise men understood about the nature of the child they were seeking. Gold, the most precious metal known to the ancient world, was the gift reserved for kings. By bringing gold, the Magi were acknowledging Jesus as royalty, as the king whose reign would exceed that of any earthly monarch. But frankincense, that costly aromatic resin harvested from trees in southern Arabia and Somalia, was even more significant. Frankincense was used exclusively in religious ceremonies, burned as incense in temples to create a sweet-smelling smoke that was believed to carry prayers to heaven. By bringing frankincense, the Magi were declaring Jesus to be divine, worthy of worship reserved only for God himself. And then there was myrrh, perhaps the most mysterious and prophetic of all their gifts. Myrrh was another precious resin, but it had a particular use in the ancient world. It was used for embalming the dead. Why would anyone bring such a somber gift to celebrate the birth of a baby? Because these wise men understood something profound about this child's mission. They knew that this king would not achieve his victory through military conquest or political power, but through sacrifice and death. The myrrh was a prophetic gift, acknowledging that Jesus had come not just to live as a king, but to die as a savior. The astronomical knowledge required to track this star across hundreds of miles of desert terrain was absolutely staggering. Remember, these men didn't have GPS, compasses, or any of the navigational tools we take for granted today. They had to rely entirely on their ability to read the stars, track celestial movements, and navigate using techniques passed down through generations of Persian astronomers. The fact that they could follow a moving celestial object across such vast distances and arrive at their precise destination speaks to a level of astronomical sophistication that rivals anything we can achieve today. When they finally arrived in Jerusalem, their appearance created an absolute sensation. Imagine the scene: a caravan of wealthy foreigners, probably accompanied by a large entourage of servants and guards, arriving at the gates of Jerusalem, asking about the birth of a new king. Word spread like wildfire through the city. Who were these mysterious visitors? What did they know that the local people didn't? And most importantly, what did their presence mean for the current political situation? King Herod's reaction to their inquiry was immediate and intense. This was a man who had built his entire reign on the principle that there was only one king in Judea, and that was him. The very suggestion that another king had been born sent him into a paranoid rage, but Herod was also crafty and calculating. Rather than openly opposing these influential foreign visitors, he decided to use them for his own purposes. The meeting between Herod and the Magi was a masterpiece of political manipulation. Herod gathered all the chief priests and teachers of the law and demanded to know where the Messiah was supposed to be born. The answer came immediately from the Hebrew scriptures: Bethlehem, the city of David. Armed with this information, Herod called the Magi aside for a private meeting where he played the role of the interested supporter, asking them to find this new king and report back to him so that he too could come and worship. Of course, Herod had no intention of worshipping anyone. His plan was ruthless and straightforward. Let these foreign wise men do the hard work of locating the exact child, then eliminate the potential threat to his throne. It was a plan that might have worked, except for one crucial factor that Herod hadn't counted on: divine intervention. The journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem should have been routine, just a short trip of about 6 miles to the south. But something extraordinary happened as soon as the Magi left Jerusalem. The star that had guided them across hundreds of miles of desert terrain appeared again, more brilliant than ever, moving ahead of them with unmistakable purpose until it stopped directly over one particular house in Bethlehem. Think about the astronomical implications of what was happening here. Stars don't typically move in ways that allow people to follow them to specific buildings. They don't stop and hover over individual houses. Whatever phenomenon the Magi were following was unlike anything in the normal course of celestial mechanics. It was behaving with intelligence and purpose, leading them with precision that no natural astronomical event could achieve. When they finally found the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, their response was immediate and profound. These were men accustomed to standing in the presence of emperors and kings, yet when they saw Jesus, they fell down and worshipped him. The text doesn't describe any hesitation or uncertainty. They knew immediately that they had found what they had been seeking. The moment when they opened their treasures and presented their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh was one of the most significant exchanges in human history. Here were representatives of the greatest empire on earth, acknowledged experts in astronomy and natural philosophy, laying their most precious possessions at the feet of a toddler in a humble house in an obscure village. By any worldly standard, it should have seemed absurd. Yet for these wise men, it was the most natural thing in the world. But the story doesn't end with the presentation of gifts. That night, as the Magi prepared for their return journey, each of them received the same warning in a dream: do not return to Herod. The God who had guided them across the desert with a star was now speaking to them directly, warning them that Herod's intentions toward the child were murderous. Without hesitation, they changed their route and returned to their own country by a different way, avoiding Jerusalem entirely. This divine warning saved not only the Magi from becoming unwilling accomplices in Herod's plot, but it also bought precious time for the Holy Family. Joseph received his own warning in a dream, telling him to take Mary and Jesus and flee to Egypt immediately. By the time Herod realized that the Magi weren't coming back to report the child's location, the family had already escaped beyond his reach. Herod's response to being outmaneuvered was swift and brutal. In a rage, he ordered the massacre of all male children in Bethlehem and the surrounding area who were 2 years old or younger. This horrific act, known as the Massacre of the Innocents, demonstrated just how seriously Herod took the threat posed by this newborn king. Yet, despite all his power and ruthlessness, he was unable to destroy the child who had been born to fulfill ancient prophecies. The theological significance of the Magi's visit extends far beyond the immediate drama of their journey. These men were Gentiles, non-Jews, who had come from outside the covenant community of Israel. Their presence at the birth of Jesus was a powerful symbol of the universal scope of God's salvation plan. The Messiah had come not just for the Jewish people, but for all nations, all ethnicities, all cultures. The fact that the first recorded worshippers of the infant Jesus were foreign scholars rather than local religious leaders sent a clear message about the inclusive nature of God's kingdom. The gifts themselves continued to play essential roles in the early life of Jesus and his family. The gold provided financial resources that enabled Joseph and Mary to finance their unexpected flight to Egypt and their years of exile there. In a world where refugees and displaced persons often faced poverty and destitution, the generous gifts of the Magi provided exactly the resources the family needed during their time of crisis. It was divine provision, delivered by foreign visitors, guided by heavenly signs. The astronomical phenomenon that guided the Magi continues to fascinate scholars and scientists to this day. Various theories have been proposed to explain what they might have seen. Some suggest it was the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation Pisces, which occurred in 7 and 6 BC and would have been visible for several months. Others point to possible comets or even supernovas that might have appeared around the time of Jesus' birth. Still, others suggest that the star might have been something entirely supernatural, a divine light that appeared specifically to guide these seekers to their destination. But perhaps the most critical aspect of the star isn't its astronomical identity, but what it represents about God's willingness to communicate through means that people can understand. The Magi were experts in reading celestial signs, so God spoke to them through the stars. He met them where they were, using their area of expertise to draw them into his unfolding plan of salvation. This pattern of divine communication continues throughout the Bible and throughout history. God speaks to people in ways they can understand and respond to. The journey of the Magi also demonstrates the incredible lengths to which people will go when they are genuinely seeking truth. These men didn't make their epic journey because it was convenient or because they had nothing better to do. They undertook one of the most difficult and dangerous trips possible in the ancient world because they believed they were witnessing something unprecedented in human history. Their willingness to sacrifice time, comfort, safety, and resources in pursuit of this newborn king speaks to the depth of their conviction and the sincerity of their seeking hearts. The fact that they were willing to worship this child, despite his humble circumstances, reveals something profound about their understanding of true kingship. They weren't impressed by palaces or military power or political influence. They were looking for something much deeper and more significant. When they found Jesus, they recognized immediately that they were in the presence of a different kind of king altogether, one whose authority came not from human appointment or conquest, but from divine appointment and purpose. The wisdom demonstrated by the Magi throughout their journey is remarkable. They knew when to speak and when to remain silent. They knew when to follow established protocols and when to break with convention. When Herod asked them to report back after finding the child, they agreed without argument. Still, when divine revelation warned them against returning to him, they had the wisdom and courage to disobey the direct command of one of the most potent and dangerous rulers in the world. This kind of discernment, the ability to distinguish between human authority and divine authority, is one of the most important lessons their story teaches us. The cultural impact of the Magi's visit has been enormous throughout Christian history. They have become symbols of the seeking heart, the scholarly pursuit of truth, and the willingness to follow divine guidance wherever it leads. Their story has inspired countless works of art, music, and literature. They have become patron saints of travelers, scholars, and seekers. Their names, tradition identifies them as Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, though these names aren't found in the biblical text, have become household words in many cultures. But perhaps most importantly, the Magi represent the first recorded example of what would become a central theme of Christianity: the inclusion of all nations and peoples in God's plan of salvation. Their presence at the birth of Jesus was a preview of the Great Commission that Jesus would later give to his disciples: to go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. The kingdom of God was never intended to be limited to one ethnic group or one geographical region. From the very beginning, it was designed to be universal in scope. The Magi's return journey to their own country marked the end of one chapter in the Christmas story, but the beginning of another. They returned home as changed men, carrying with them the memory of having seen the infant Messiah and the knowledge that the ancient prophecies were being fulfilled before their eyes. Tradition suggests that they became some of the earliest missionaries, spreading the news of Christ's birth throughout the Persian Empire and beyond. Their influence may have extended far beyond their own generation. Some historians suggest that the Magi's testimony about their encounter with the infant Jesus may have prepared the ground for the later rapid spread of Christianity throughout the Persian Empire. When Christian missionaries eventually reached those regions, they may have found populations that had already heard stories about the newborn king from the descendants and disciples of the original Magi. The story of the Magi challenges us to consider our own response to divine revelation. Like these ancient seekers, we live in a world filled with competing voices and conflicting claims about truth and meaning. The Magi's example shows us what it looks like to pursue truth with genuine commitment, to be willing to act on what we discover, and to worship authentically when we encounter the divine. Their willingness to travel so far and sacrifice so much in response to a celestial sign raises important questions about our own spiritual sensitivity. Are we paying attention to the ways God might be trying to communicate with us? Are we willing to step out of our comfort zones and pursue truth wherever it leads? Are we prepared to worship genuinely when we encounter the presence of God, regardless of how different it might be from our expectations? The gifts of the Magi, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, also challenge us to consider what we have to offer in our own worship and service. Gold represents our material resources, the wealth and possessions we can dedicate to God's purposes. Frankincense represents our worship and devotion, the praise and prayer we offer in recognition of God's holiness and worthiness. Myrrh represents our willingness to share in sacrifice and suffering, to follow Christ even when the path leads through difficulty and loss. The timing of the Magi's visit is significant in ways that often go unnoticed. They didn't arrive at the moment of Jesus' birth, as popular Christmas pageants often suggest. By the time they reached Bethlehem, Jesus was likely between several months and 2 years old, living with his family in a house rather than the temporary stable where he was born. This means that their journey began long before Jesus was actually born, guided by astronomical signs that preceded his arrival. Their faith was based not on seeing the fulfillment of prophecy, but on trusting that the signs they were witnessing pointed towards something significant that was about to happen. This element of their story speaks to the nature of faith itself. The Magi began their journey based on limited information and uncertain outcomes. They didn't know exactly what they would find when they reached their destination. They didn't know how long the journey would take or what dangers they might face along the way. They simply trusted that the signs they had witnessed were pointing them towards something worth pursuing, and they acted on that trust with remarkable commitment and courage. The political dimensions of their story also deserve careful consideration. The Magi were not just private individuals pursuing a personal spiritual quest. They were official representatives of the Persian Empire, probably holding positions equivalent to cabinet-level advisors or even ambassadors. Their journey to Jerusalem to inquire about the birth of a new king was essentially a diplomatic mission, though motivated by spiritual rather than political concerns. Their decision to avoid Herod on their return journey wasn't just a matter of personal safety. It was an act of international defiance against one of Rome's client kings. They chose to obey divine revelation rather than human authority. even when that human authority was backed by the military might of the Roman Empire. This decision required not only spiritual discernment, but considerable political courage. The mystery surrounding their identities adds another layer of fascination to their story. The biblical text identifies them simply as Magi from the East, without giving names, specific countries of origin, or even the exact number of travelers. The traditional idea that there were 3 of them comes from the fact that 3 gifts are mentioned, but the text doesn't actually specify how many people were involved. Historical traditions have assigned them various names and backgrounds, but these details come from later legends rather than biblical sources. This ambiguity might be intentional, allowing the Magi to represent all people who seek God with sincere hearts, regardless of their specific cultural or ethnic backgrounds. They stand as symbols of the universal human longing for meaning, truth, and connection with the divine. Their story demonstrates that God reveals himself to genuine seekers, no matter where they come from or what their previous religious background might be. The intellectual courage demonstrated by the Magi is particularly relevant in our contemporary context. These were learned men, respected scholars who were willing to risk their reputations by pursuing what others might have dismissed as superstition or wishful thinking. They were willing to act on their convictions, even when doing so might have seemed foolish or impractical to their peers. In our age of scientific skepticism and religious pluralism, the Magi's example challenges both believers and skeptics to approach questions of spiritual truth with genuine openness and intellectual honesty. They remind us that the pursuit of truth sometimes requires us to consider possibilities that don't fit neatly into our existing worldviews or academic categories. The legacy of the Magi extends far beyond the Christmas story itself. They have become archetypal figures representing wisdom, seeking, devotion, and the intersection of faith and learning. Their story continues to inspire people from all backgrounds who are engaged in the ongoing human quest for meaning and truth. They remind us that the search for God is not limited by geographical boundaries, cultural differences, or educational backgrounds. As we reflect on this incredible story of ancient wisdom and divine guidance, we're reminded that the birth of Jesus Christ was an event of cosmic significance that drew seekers from the ends of the earth. The Magi's journey from Persia to Bethlehem represents the first chapter in a story that continues to unfold today as people from every nation and culture discover the transformative power of encountering Christ. The star that guided them across the desert has never stopped shining. The invitation to seek and find, to worship and serve, remains open to all who have eyes to see and hearts to believe. The gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh that they presented continue to symbolize the offerings we can bring in our own encounters with the divine. Our resources, our worship, and our willingness to share in the mission of redemption that began in that humble house in Bethlehem over 2,000 years ago. The aftermath of the Magi's visit rippled through history in ways that continue to influence our world today. Their dramatic appearance in Jerusalem, bearing expensive gifts and asking pointed questions about a newborn king, sent shockwaves through the political and religious establishment of first-century Palestine. The very fact that foreign dignitaries would travel such enormous distances based on astronomical observations challenged everyone's assumptions about how divine revelation works and who has access to spiritual truth. The religious leaders in Jerusalem, despite being the official guardians of Hebrew scripture and messianic prophecy, had completely missed the significance of the celestial signs that had been so obvious to these Persian astronomers. This ironic reversal, outsiders recognizing what insiders had overlooked, became a recurring theme throughout Jesus' ministry and continues to challenge religious institutions today. The scholarly preparation that enabled the Magi to recognize and interpret the star's significance represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cross-cultural knowledge transfer. For this level of understanding to develop, Persian scholars must have spent generations studying Hebrew texts, learning the language, understanding the historical context, and developing sophisticated interpretations of prophetic literature. This wasn't casual academic interest. It was deep, sustained intellectual engagement with a foreign religious tradition. The mathematical and astronomical calculations required to predict the timing and location of messianic events based on celestial phenomena would have demanded extraordinary precision. These scholars had to correlate multiple complex systems: Hebrew chronology, astronomical cycles, geographical coordinates, and prophetic interpretation. The fact that their calculations were accurate enough to guide them to the exact location where they would find the infant Jesus speaks to a level of scholarly sophistication that rivals any academic achievement in human history. Consider the logistics of organizing such an expedition. The Magi couldn't simply decide to take a quick trip to Palestine. They had to obtain official permission from Persian authorities, secure funding for an expensive journey, assemble a traveling party large enough to provide security and handle practical needs, gather sufficient supplies for months of travel, and coordinate their departure timing with astronomical events they had calculated years in advance. This was a massive undertaking that required careful planning, significant resources, and unwavering commitment to their mission. The route they chose for their journey would have taken them through some of the most challenging terrain in the ancient world. Traveling westward from Persia toward Palestine meant crossing the Mesopotamian desert, navigating mountain passes, and traversing regions controlled by various tribal groups and political entities. They would have encountered extreme temperature variations, water shortages, sandstorms, and the constant threat of bandit attacks. The physical demands alone would have tested the endurance of even the most experienced travelers. The caravan they assembled must have been impressive in both size and wealth. Carrying precious gifts like gold, frankincense, and myrrh across such distances would have required serious security measures. They probably traveled with armed guards, multiple pack animals, servants to handle daily needs, and backup supplies in case of emergencies. The sight of such a magnificent caravan approaching the gates of Jerusalem would have drawn attention from miles away. The astronomical instruments and navigational tools they carried would have been the most advanced technology of their era. Persian astronomers had developed sophisticated devices for measuring celestial positions, calculating planetary movements, and determining geographical coordinates. They probably carried astrolabes, armillary spheres, star charts drawn on precious materials, and mathematical tables that had taken generations to compile. These weren't just tools, they were repositories of centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge. The cultural exchange that occurred during their visit had implications that extended far beyond the immediate Christmas story. When these Persian scholars encountered Hebrew religious traditions in their most authentic form, and when Palestinian Jews met Persian wisdom traditions embodied in living practitioners, it created opportunities for mutual understanding that would influence both cultures for generations. The Magi returned to Persia carrying not just memories of having seen the infant Messiah, but detailed knowledge of Hebrew theology, Jewish customs, and Palestinian geography. The linguistic challenges they faced during their journey add another dimension to their remarkable achievement. Communication across the various cultures and regions they traversed would have required knowledge of multiple languages and dialects. They probably spoke Persian, Aramaic, and possibly Greek or Hebrew. Finding interpreters, negotiating with local authorities, and conducting business transactions in foreign languages while maintaining the secrecy necessary for their mission, required diplomatic skills of the highest order. The timing of their arrival in relation to other events in Jesus' early life reveals the intricate way divine providence was orchestrating multiple storylines simultaneously. While the Magi were making their way across the desert, guided by their star, Mary and Joseph were settling into life in Bethlehem after the birth of Jesus. The shepherds had already received their angelic announcement and visited the newborn child. The presentation in the temple, where Simeon and Anna recognized the infant Messiah, had probably already occurred. The Magi's visit represented the culmination of a series of divine revelations, each confirming the significance of this child's birth through different means and to different audiences. The gifts they brought carried economic as well as symbolic value. Gold was the universal currency of the ancient world, easily transported and immediately recognizable as valuable in any culture. The amount they brought was probably substantial enough to finance the Holy Family's exile in Egypt for several years. Frankincense was worth more than its weight in gold, harvested from rare trees in remote regions and traded through complex commercial networks that spanned continents. Myrrh was equally precious, valued for its medicinal properties as well as its use in burial preparations. The combined value of these three gifts would have represented enormous wealth by first-century standards. The psychological impact of their visit on Mary and Joseph must have been profound. Here were obviously important and educated men, representatives of one of the world's great civilizations, traveling enormous distances to worship their child and present him with gifts fit for royalty. For a young couple from a small town in Galilee, this extraordinary recognition of their son's significance must have been both affirming and overwhelming. It provided powerful confirmation that the angel's announcements about Jesus' identity and mission were indeed true. The theological implications of their story continue to generate discussion among biblical scholars and theologians. Their status as Gentiles who received divine revelation independently of Hebrew religious institutions challenges traditional assumptions about how God communicates with humanity. Their recognition of Jesus as king, deity, and sacrificial lamb, based entirely on astronomical observations and ancient texts, demonstrates that divine truth can be accessed through multiple channels by sincere seekers. The influence of their testimony on the early Christian church was probably more significant than most people realize. When Christian missionaries eventually reached Persia and surrounding regions, they may have found populations already prepared by stories passed down from the original Magi. The rapid spread of Christianity throughout the Persian Empire in the centuries following Christ's resurrection might have been facilitated by the groundwork laid by these first Gentile witnesses to Jesus' significance. The artistic and literary legacy of the Magi has enriched human culture for 2 millennia. They appear in countless paintings, sculptures, musical compositions, and literary works. They have inspired architectural masterpieces, influenced holiday traditions, and provided symbolic vocabulary for discussing the relationship between faith and reason, between revelation and scholarship, between Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. Their story has been retold and reimagined in every generation, each culture finding new meanings and applications in their remarkable journey. The scientific questions raised by their story continue to fascinate researchers in fields ranging from astronomy to archaeology. The search for historical and astronomical explanations for the Star of Bethlehem has produced an enormous body of scholarly literature, computer simulations of ancient skies, and sophisticated theories about possible celestial phenomena that might have guided their journey. While definitive answers remain elusive, the investigation itself has advanced our understanding of ancient astronomy, first-century chronology, and the relationship between scientific observation and religious interpretation. The diplomatic dimensions of their story offer insights into ancient international relations and the complex political situation in first-century Palestine. Their visit represented unofficial but significant contact between the Persian and Roman empires, mediated through their shared interest in a Jewish baby born in an obscure Palestinian village. Their decision to avoid Herod on their return journey demonstrated remarkable courage in defying a Roman client king, setting a precedent for choosing divine authority over human power that would characterize Christian resistance to imperial persecution for centuries to come. The educational legacy of the Magi reminds us of the value of interdisciplinary learning and cross-cultural scholarship. Their ability to synthesize astronomy, theology, history, geography, and linguistics in pursuit of truth represents an ideal of comprehensive education that remains relevant today. They demonstrate that the most important discoveries often occur at the intersection of multiple fields of knowledge, requiring both specialized expertise and broad intellectual curiosity. Their story concludes not with their arrival in Bethlehem, but with their transformation and return. They had set out as curious scholars following an interesting astronomical phenomenon. They returned home as witnesses to divine incarnation, carrying testimony that would echo through eternity. Their encounter with the infant Jesus had changed them from seekers into evangelists, from observers into participants in the unfolding drama of redemption. The star that guided them across the desert represents more than just a celestial phenomenon. It symbolizes the divine initiative in human salvation. God didn't wait for people to find him through their own efforts. He actively reached out, using means they could understand and follow, drawing them into a relationship with himself. The star was God's invitation, extended to anyone with eyes to see and courage to follow. Today, people from every nation continue to follow their own versions of that star, guided by the same divine love that drew the Magi across the ancient world to worship a newborn king. Their journey reminds us that the search for God is not limited by geography, culture, education, or background. The invitation remains open, the star continues to shine, and the Christ child they found in Bethlehem still welcomes all who come seeking truth with sincere hearts and genuine devotion. The people of the Magi, the Persian scholars who recognized divine truth in celestial signs and responded with courage, commitment, and worship, represent all of us who are still following stars, still seeking truth, still hoping to encounter the divine in the midst of our human journey. Their story is our story, their quest is our quest, and their discovery is available to all who have the wisdom to recognize divine light when it appears, and the faith to follow wherever it leads.